Uh, Hi everyone. Happy Saturday. Welcome to this webinar. And I think it's our fourth or fifth session this year of the RISE-MICCAI Journal Club. So uh, good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are joining in from. So let me introduce the speaker today. And then afterwards, when Arna goes through his slides, you can just directly ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and then I can repeat the question and then I can answer those. So let's welcome our speaker. So Arna recently completed his PhD at McGill University and at Mila in Montreal, working with Dr. Blake Richards on neuroscience-inspired AI, specifically working on representation learning and credit assignment. During his PhD, he worked on characterizing the manifold geometry of learned representations and corresponding learning dynamics in self-supervised deep neural networks of computer vision. Arna has been a student researcher at Google and also a research scientist intern at CTRL Labs and Meta AI. Prior to his doctoral studies, he obtained a master's in neuroscience, also at McGill, and a bachelor's in electrical engineering from IIT Kharagpur in India. Arna's work has been published in top-tier AI conferences, including NeuroIvs and iClear, and he has also been awarded the prestigious one-year scholarship from the Government of Canada. I think Arna, it's...
Cool. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Just quickly go ahead, share my screen. All right. I hope you can see my screen.
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Pulkit, for introducing me, and thank you everyone for showing up. It's always nice to present, um, uh, my PhD work to people, and I'm curious to kind of know what you think about it and how you see this work, how this fits into what you guys are doing in your own research or your own pursuits. Um, so my talk is titled "Bridging the Conceptual Gap Between Brains and AI," which is a mouthful if you think about it. And I'm going to focus on the representation learning aspects of my PhD work. But before I dive right into it, I thought I'll just start with an introduction of what does it mean to be in the field of neuro AI, because it can mean a lot of things, and I think it should mean a lot of things because it's such a diverse field. But I thought I'll just start with what it means to me or what it meant to me during my PhD. So I kind of think about the entire neuro AI field in terms of a research framework, because when you're talking to someone not in the field, brains and AI or artificial neural networks specifically can seem similar in a lot of things, but dissimilar in a lot of things. For instance, you can say both brains and artificial neural networks can actually do a lot of complex tasks, achieve good performance on reasonably complex tasks, which may seem similar at the computational level if you think about it. They're solving similar kinds of problems. But at the same time, if you go right into it, I mean, one is the brain is a carbon-based life form. Artificial neural networks are currently silicon-based, chips. So in some sense, they're as different as it gets. Like even the base substrate is different. So where are these shared computational principles? Where do they lie, and what do we actually study? Because even though the top computational level is similar, the implementation level is very different. So the way I think about it is like any intelligent system, could be brain, could be artificial neural network, is driven by a few factors. So you can kind of study each of these factors in isolation. So two big factors that kind of determine the behavior of learning systems are basically what is the data diet that the system is fed, and what is the loss function or the objective function that you're trying to optimize. Although there's a lot of work going on in those directions, I personally have not focused as much on these two directions during my PhD. A big pillar that I feel is very important or is key is understanding the learned latent representations or representations as we call them. So how is the data transformed to the output through intermediate computational steps, and what do they look like? And that I think is a key aspect, which is what my talk will be focusing on more today. But there's also the learning rule and dynamics. How are these representations shaped? How the computations emerge? How does the function from data to the output change over time with experience? And you also have the implicit bias of architecture, specifically what kind of architecture or what functions are enabled by the architecture of the system that you have. And specifically, now we're talking about the connectivity, because we're at the heart of it, we are connectionists. We talk about how the computations is done by synaptic connections or weights that like McMulls that actually transform your data from one form to from one space to the other. And I've been quite fortunate to collaborate with other people in the lab, specifically in Blake's lab, or more wider at Mila, on the architecture pillar and some stuff on the learning rule. I've also been working on my own project during my PhD, which is basically understanding what it means to learn in a noisy gradient settings, which is a more biologically realistic settings. But I'll not be focusing on that for today. Today, I'll be focusing on these two projects, and we'll see how far we get along. But the project that I want to start with is the project called AlphaRec. Now, this project is basically a collaboration that started during COVID with two of my other friends, and then we kind of roped in Blake and got this to a state that is actually presentable. So Blake was kind of key to the you know drive our forces in a direction, in a coherent direction that actually amounted to something. But Kumar Krishna Agrawal is a PhD student at Berkeley, and Arna was a PhD student at McGill and Mila as well. He's currently at Apple. All three of us met during our undergrads back in India, in IIT Kharagpur, and we've been working, since, and it's been a fun collaboration. So the core of the project, or core of this question, is self-supervised learning and representations in self-supervised learning. Just to give you a bit of an introduction, or a real quick introduction of self-supervised learning. I'm pretty sure many of you are familiar with it already. But self-supervised learning is the ultimate promise of learning representations or good representations from unlabeled data. So you don't require human annotated labels anymore. And the general framework for a lot of these methods that are labeled under the self-supervised learning umbrella is that you want representations of similar objects to be similar and dissimilar objects to be dissimilar. And we'll talk more about this later. And you want these representations to be good enough so that it can be used for some downstream tasks. Could be classification, could be segmentation, could be some report generation, some sort of like cross-modality tasks. It turns out the current SSL methods can actually match supervised learning performance on natural image classification, but there's also a ton of new work that is coming up on using SSL methods to learn good representations of medical images, which I think is a very exciting domain now, because there is a ton of unstructured or unlabeled data in the medical imaging domain that we can now leverage to learn good representations without having to collect high quality human annotated labels. So just to again give you a quick overview of what it means is, I think what I like is the contrastive learning framework, specifically the Sinclair framework, which works only on images, on natural images specifically. So the idea is, if you take an image, let's say an image of a dog, if you take two different transformations, so two different crops or two different color transformations, you end up with the same object, different views of the same object. You want to learn representations that are similar across different views. So you pass them through some CNN, some projector, MLP, you get some embeddings, and you want the things that are similar to attract, and the representations obtained from different views of different images to repel. So you want the dog images to repel from the chair images. So that's kind of the overall framework, or the general framework in which you can think about self-supervised learning. But we can go into the details a bit later on, and I'll talk more about how this matches with other frameworks of self-supervised learning. Right, and as I said, I think Sinclair is a canonical example. It's not the only framework, and it turns out in SSL people have been using a lot of interesting frameworks to learn good representations from unlabeled data. But what does it mean to learn good representations? Well, right now, we don't really, how do you actually measure the quality of these learned representations? Because what you're optimizing is some function where similar things are similar and dissimilar things are dissimilar, let's say. So loss is not that informative. What we currently do, or we would like to do, is we use the downstream task performance and use that as a metric of representation quality. So imagine you've trained 100 different models with 100 different hyperparameters or at different stages of training. You can imagine any scenario. You would actually have to evaluate each of those models on a suite of downstream tasks, see how well they perform, and use the performance as an evaluation metric to see which model is the best model that you can release to production. Now, there are two problems with this. One is you now need task labels to assess the representation quality, which kind of goes against the promise of self-supervised learning, because now you're saying, well, we can learn representations, but we don't know how good they are till we have high quality human annotated data. And it also adds to the entire time and compute in development of these models. You have actually have to, I mean, sure, training is an expensive process, but so is collecting high quality labels and evaluating on a suite of downstream tasks. So what we wanted to do is we asked this question that, or we want a measure of representation quality that does not require this human annotated labeled data. And this is where we turn to the brain for inspiration. It would not be a neuro AI talk if I don't talk about the brain at all. So here we are. And we wanted to seek inspiration from the brain to find a solution and to understand what is the geometry of representations in the brain. Because again, we're looking at brain as our ground truth system that can solve these computational tasks without having to do a bunch of hyperparameter tasks, hyperparameter selection at the get-go. So what do the representations in the brain look like? And we were looking specifically at this paper from Nature back in 2019, which looks at the geometry, high dimensional geometry of population responses in the visual cortex. You might be wondering why suddenly look at visual cortex, especially this is in the mice visual cortex. So as it turns out, the mice visual cortex is not as hierarchical as primates or humans. Um, and representations in the primary visual cortex are supposed to be generic enough to support a large variety of tasks in mice. And that is something that is a desirable quality for our SSL networks because we want representations to be generic enough to support a large variety of downstream tasks. And that's where the shared computational principle lies in. So very briefly, what they did is, and what the same thing that we will do is, let's say you have a system, you pass m different stimuli, let's say natural images for the sake of simplicity here. So you have m different natural images and you're recording from n neurons or units or n. So each stimulus is mapped to an n-dimensional representation space. So basically each input corresponds to a point in this n-dimensional space, which you can now write this representation matrix as an n by m matrix. If you take the cross covariance of this matrix and calculate the eigenvalues of this matrix, it turns out it follows a power law, the eigenvalue, which means that if you plot the eigenvalue with its index on a log-log plot, it turns out to be roughly a straight line. And what we'll define, or what they defined, is the slope of this power law, or the slope of this decay, as alpha. So that is what we would be measuring. That is what our metric is, and that is what they looked at as well. They showed that in the mice primary visual cortex, this alpha is very close to 1. Now, what does this alpha actually tell us? So they have some motivation from an infinite dimensional perspective. Um, and just to give you an overview, they have some derivations from if your representations are infinite dimensional. So basically what they say is, or what they show, that if your alpha is less than 1, so your decay is, or the slope of decay is not fast enough, it's a slow decay, that actually corresponds to a discontinuous representation space. If it's more than 1, but less than 1 plus 2 over d, where d is the intrinsic stimulus dimensionality, it's a fractal, so it's continuous, but it's non-differentiable. And if it's more than 1 plus 2 over d, but it's continuous. Again, great math, but what does it look pictorially? So imagine you have a one-dimensional stimulus. Imagine you're trying to represent, instead of natural images, just positions on a line. So you can have different types of coding properties. If you have a low dimensional tuning curve, so what the first row shows here is tuning curves of different units or different neurons. So you can think of the y-axis being the activity and the different colors corresponding to different units. The x-axis here is the position on the line. If you take an eigenspectrum of this code, you will have a low dimensional because it's basically overlapping codes. A random projection to a 3D space would look something like this. If you have efficient coding, which means that you have one unit for every position on the line, again, infinite dimensional stimulus, infinite points on the line. So you have access to like each neuron or each unit responds to one particular point on this line. That would mean that the unit responds when position on the line is here, otherwise it does not, which is why you have these bars. If you take the variance or eigenspectrum of this, it's a flat line, and that corresponds to a very discrete ball in this three-dimensional space. And that is a discontinuous stimulus because you can imagine if you move very slightly on this line, you have a huge difference, huge change in the representation space. And so on and so forth. You can think about the fractal and the continuous domains where you have smoother and smoother projections in some 3D space. I think this is a good time if there are any questions that I can answer. Let me just quickly check the Q&A. Okay, so I guess we're good for now, right, Pulkit?
Yeah, good for now. But maybe
Cool.
I can ask a question.
Yeah, go for it, go for it.
Could you explain what are these tuning curves again?
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
how are these sampled? Like, what's the difference between A and B?
Right. So, sorry, yeah, okay. So what's the difference between A and B? That's a great question. I think A and B, I think, are two extremes of this coding property. So, for instance, in A, okay, I should start with each color. It corresponds to one neuron. So imagine there is a neuron, I don't know, the blue neuron that peaks when the animal or when the stimulus is basically this position, which is I don't know if you can see my red dot, but that is the position. So that is when the blue neuron as it is at its peak firing rate or is it at its peak activation. But if you move the stimulus to this point, it's basically at its lowest firing rate, almost zero. Um, so that is kind of what this tuning curve is indicating, that how does the firing rate or activation of a unit or a neuron varies as, let's say, the animal moves on this line. On the other hand, the efficient coding is so obviously these are overlapping low dimensional stimulus because there's a lot of redundancy. Like if you look at, I don't know, a few neurons, you can kind of gauge where the animal is at without looking at every other neuron. But in the efficient coding perspective, which is something that was proposed by Horace Barlow back in, I think, the 1960s, basically Horace Barlow's entire idea was that neurons in the brain are kind of orthogonally coding stimuli. So if there's one neuron that codes for this, no other neuron will try to react to that stimulus. So which is the kind of case here that every neuron responds to one particular position on the space. That kind of corresponds to the tuning curves in the efficient coding perspective. Does that I don't know, give a bit more clarity?
Yeah, and that's great.
Okay,
I
cool.
think there's a Q&A question, if you could see.
Yeah, I do see. Like, can you give some concrete examples? I mean, like, do you mean a concrete example in a natural image kind of representation domain, or because I think for me the 1D perspective is helpful to kind of grasp what is going on, what is alpha kind of indicating. But if you're looking for how do these spectra look like in deep neural networks, I have some examples later on, so maybe we can hold it on to them.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Okay. If that's that, then I guess I'll move on to the next part of the presentation, where we actually go into some of the deep neural networks, so which is maybe a bit more interesting. Right, but this is where I kind of wanted to stop because this kind of gives a motivation for what does alpha tell us about the representation space. Um, and I think the problem with this motivation is it deals with an infinite dimensional representations. And honestly, there's nothing that is infinite dimensional at this point of time. We are always dealing with finite dimensional representations. No matter how wide your neural network is, it's still finite. And if you try to port those derivations that they have from infinite dimensions to finite dimensions, these bounds no longer hold. In fact, they don't work out as it does for infinite dimensional perspective. So let's look at the problem once again. Basically, in SSL, you have an input. You want to learn an encoder that gives you representations. And from there, you would want to read out to get some task-specific output. So the training the encoder is the pre-training stage, and training the readout is the task-specific training or fine-tuning, whatever you want to call it. Now, what we've been looking at so far is properties of the encoder that the eigenspectrum of these representations tell us. So is the encoder learning a continuous representation, discontinuous, or fractal, and so on. What we will be doing is we'll be focusing our attention on the readout stage, that looking at the eigenspectrum of these representations, are there any guarantees that we can have on the properties of this readout in training this readout. And when I say training this readout, I'll add an extra bias on this, or extra constraint, that we will be training these readout networks using gradient descent. So what I'll do is I'll quickly show some results from on a finite dimensional perspective, but a linear readout setting. So what happens if you try to do a linear regression on top of some representations with eigenspectrum that follows a power law? So we have two main theorems. I'll quickly go over it without going over the exact wording of it. What I'll basically tell you is that large values of alpha, which means a rapid decay, basically implies a longer convergence time for gradient descent. So which means you'd have to train much longer, in fact, exponentially longer, to actually get to a good solution if you have a steep decay. And that this basically goes into the fact that if you have a direction with a small variance or small eigenvalue, it takes much longer for gradient descent to find a good weight or good readout weight. The other theorem is basically that small values of alpha leads to overfitting due to noise when using gradient descent. So gradient descent will actually, if again, small values of alpha means you have a flat eigenspectrum, which means you are encoding a lot of different properties from your stimulus domain into your representations. And gradient descent will try to fit weights in all of these domains, even if they are not really all of these features, even if they're not really task relevant, or they're like noise features for the task. So gradient descent now becomes prone to overfitting. And again, what this looks pictorially is, again, if I'm running a linear regression and I'm just plotting the train MSE loss and the test MSE loss by artificially varying the alpha of my representation space. So I'm just controlling what the eigenspectrum of this representation looks like by artificially setting up this representation, this linear regression problem, and I'm looking at the properties of readout in terms of the training and generalization. So you can clearly see for large values of alpha, you have slow training as well as like poor testing performance. So which corresponds to your underfitting regime. For low values of alpha, you kind of have this good training, but bad testing performance, because now you're starting to overfit. And there is a Goldilocks zone in between, like close to alpha one, where you're not really overfitting, you're not really underfitting, you're getting good test performance. Um, it is worth noting that there is some theoretical work, again, in theoretical machine learning, linear regression, kernel progression perspectives, where they say that if your representations are infinite dimensional and alpha is 1, you get something called benign overfitting, where you're overfitting on the training data without hurting your generalization performance. So there is a bit of a convergence from the neuroscience domain as well as from the machine learning domain that all converged to this point of alpha 1 at an infinite dimensional perspective. What we're getting to is somewhere in middle, where you're taking a finite dimensional perspective and trying to fit it with linear regression theory and trying to get at the same question. I guess, again, if there are any questions, happy to answer them and then move on to the more empirical part of the study. All right. I guess no questions as of now. So great. Moving on. So we wanted to take this as inspiration that alpha is indicative of some downstream task performance. So we wanted to see, can we extend this to deep neural networks? Is alpha indicative of downstream task performance in representations obtained from deep neural networks? And is there a specific value of alpha? Because now I told you that at infinite dimensions, alpha 1 is the optimal thing to do, but finite dimensions in deep neural networks, what is the value of alpha that might be optimal? And finally, we wanted to answer our initial question that I began with. Can we use alpha for some model selection in self-supervised learning pipelines without using any human annotated labels? So what we did to answer the first question is we took networks pre-trained on ImageNet. Again, we are staying in the natural images domain here. So we took networks pre-trained on ImageNet, and we wanted to evaluate how good those representations are in terms of solving the STL10 and MIT67 datasets. So again, to give a bit of a recap, ImageNet is an object recognition dataset. STL10 is a subsampled version of the dataset that is also object recognition. So generally, networks that are trained to do object recognition on ImageNet do learn representations that are good for STL10. For MIT67, uh, it's a scene recognition dataset. So networks that are trained to do specifically object recognition may not do as well on MIT67 because they learn different features. And what we did in each of these cases is we were looking at the alpha of the representations and the downstream task performance using a linear readout network and seeing if there is a correlation. I should say whatever results I'm going to show also hold for non-linear readout. So if you have an MLP readout and stuff like that. Right. So let's just focus on the STL10 results for now, where again, so what I'm showing here on the left is, or in this plot is that I'm taking representations from ResNet 50 networks pre-trained on the ImageNet dataset using different loss functions. So you have your good old supervised neural network here, but you also have three self-supervised learning losses. So Barlow twins, SimClear, BYOL. Again, SimClear is the one that I showed you at the very start. Barlow twins, I'll talk more about that. BYOL is another self-supervised learning networks. If you guys have heard about JEPA or Dino, it's kind of BYOL on steroids with VIT. So it's very familiar in the domain of self-supervised learning, especially if you work with SSL and medical images. But so each dot here corresponds to a representation obtained from a different layer of this network. And as you see, there is a strong correlation between the alpha of the representation and the corresponding downstream task accuracy. And now we can do the, like here, we were fixing the architecture, changing the pre-training losses. We can do the flip thing that we fix the losses and change the architectures. So if we take the networks trained using supervised loss function and look at different architectures, we have something like this. And again, you have your ResNets and VGGs, which kind of lie on this side yes, our code is publicly released. Sorry, I just said the question. Yes, code is publicly released. I'll also talk about a library that we recently released in case you want to evaluate these metrics on your own networks. So ResNets and VGG are basically on this side, on the left side of your alpha 1 line. But VITs do something very interesting. And I think this is something that I don't quite understand completely why this is happening. But it seems like attention learns some low dimensional representations and then gradually increases the rank of the representation or makes the eigenvalues flatter. But overall, if you look at it, it does seem like there is a good correlation between alpha and the downstream task performance. If you look very closely at it, you could see that the optimal value of alpha for different family of models might be slightly different, and I'll talk more about that later. So this was an STL10. For MIT67, roughly the results hold with a big caveat, which is the results hold for self-supervised learning networks. If you look at it, the correlations are significant for the self-supervised learning trained networks, not for the supervised learning trained networks. And again, as I said, the networks that are trained to do supervised learning on ImageNet learn features that are specific for object recognition, not for scene recognition. And MIT67 requires features that are more scene recognition, that are useful for scene recognition. So this brings us to one particular point to keep in mind when you're using alpha to evaluate your networks. Alpha looks at how is the information distributed in this high dimensional space. So what is the geometry of representations in a high dimensional space, not what information is represented. So if you have features that are not relevant to a downstream task, alpha is not necessarily useful because you're not quantifying that. But on the other hand, if you're training a self-supervised learning network, it learns features that are general, that capture the general structure of the stimulus space. Alpha is indeed very useful because what you're looking at is how is the representation, how the representation structured, assuming that most of the important information is kind of represented already. Right. And so that again gives us a positive note and something to keep in mind. But the good thing is for self-supervised learning networks, we can still use alpha, and there is a correlation between alpha and downstream task performance. Two other desirable properties of alpha is, well, it does not require labels, so that fits our bill. Second thing is it also takes less compute resources and time than actually doing performance evaluation or downstream task with a linear probe. And this is where I already talked about that the code is publicly available, so you can use it both to kind of do the linear probe evaluation on representations as well as like computing alpha. So based on these results and these notes, the proposal that we wanted to test out is, can we use alpha to filter out the bad models a priori and perform linear evaluation only on the good models to choose our best models? And if you have 100 models, you use alpha to filter out the bad models, choose, let's say, 5 candidate models, and you do evaluation on only those 5 good models to choose one best model. Or if you want to use some sort of like mixture of experts, that's on you. But you want to choose some candidate good models without using all your models. So again, to test out this proposal, what we wanted to do is repeat this experiment that we did for pre-trained networks by pre-training our own networks on the self-supervised loss function. So we did a case study with Barlow twins. Without going again into the architecture, it's very similar to the Sinclair architecture. The loss function is different. The idea is that again, you take two different views of the same image. You learn some representations, learn some embeddings, which is like representation is your encoder and the output of an MLP is your embeddings. You want to learn a cross correlation matrix between the two embeddings of the two views to be identity, which basically means that you want the features of each, the different features of the two views to be same, while also encoding some sort of orthogonality based on the proposal of Horace Barlow from 1960s, that the different features should be orthogonal. So your loss function contains two terms: the invariance term, that how different are two features for corresponding to two different views, or the same feature corresponding to two different views, and what is the redundancy between two different features within the same image. So if you look closely, there's two hyperparameters here. One is the weight of the redundancy reduction term, and the dimensionality of the embeddings, or basically the dimensionality of the optimization space. This, again, with any good neural network or neural network pipeline, you would have to, vary those two hyperparameters, do a hyperparameter search, and that's exactly what we did. We searched for those two, we swept over different values of these two hyperparameters, and we're looking at the loss, the alpha, and the downstream evaluation. I see a question which probably is very relevant to what we're doing, like this slide of the previous two slides. I'll just answer it right now. Do you need to use labels with the evaluation data sets? So in the experiments that I showed, where we were looking if alpha is correlated with the downstream task, we did, because that's kind of the point, that is alpha related to the downstream task. If you're actually thinking about doing the model selection, you should not need to use labels. You can compute alpha without using labels on any evaluation data set. Right. So basically, these are the results here so we pre-trained on two different data sets, CFAR10 and STL10. So which is why I was like, this is a relevant question to what we're doing. On the left plot here is the loss. Like I said, the pre-training loss is not necessarily indicative of how good your models are, because you can see there's huge chunks of this design or the hyperparameters configuration space that have similar or equivalent loss values, but the test accuracy is wildly different. So there's basically a trend there where you can say that all these models are probably good, but they're not actually equivalent in terms of downstream task evaluation. But if you look at alpha, you see that there's a strong correspondence between the test accuracy and alpha. So that again lends more weight to the idea that alpha can be used for downstream alpha can be used for model selection, because it's very strongly correlated with your downstream task performance. Another quick question here. Did you also look at the utility of alpha for VLP techniques, CLIP, LAVA, etc., to estimate or quantify how much semantic information is added by another modality and how much it contributes to learning those latent representations? So we haven't done exactly that study. I can show you some very quick results on using alpha for large language models, we haven't gone into the multimodal domain yet, but that is in the plans, in the works, whatever. I think there is some preliminary evidence that you can look at some of these models, especially during training, to figure out whether the hyperparameter configuration is good or not, but we have not done a much more systematic study to answer that question. But yeah, that is definitely something that can be done. Right, and again, just to kind of cover all our bases, you can do it for you can measure alpha on different downstream tasks to get a sense of how well or how good it is for out of distribution tasks. And basically, the key takeaways from this point that I hope you can take away as a summary is there exists a power law decay in the eigenspectrum of the representation covariance matrix. In the paper, we have experiments from other self-supervised learning pipelines as well. So there is a similarity between brains and deep neural networks. And alpha actually tracks generalization performance, and it can be used to guide model selection in self-supervised learning frameworks. Again, in the paper, which is published at Neuro 2022, we outline a model selection algorithm where you can use alpha to do model selection at a much lower computational compute budget. I'll just read out the question here. What are the results if evaluating with STL10 and MIT67 without using the labels? I'm not sure I completely understand the question. If you could maybe, I don't know, add some context or clarify, that would be great. But also happy to answer any other questions that are there at this point. Okay, there's another question, which is how expensive is it to compute alpha? It's actually quite cheap. So here, this is in terms of the time budget. This is how long it takes to compute alpha, this is in like 3 seconds to compute on CFAR10. STL10 again 5 seconds, ImageNet 4 minutes as compared to like the linear probe evaluation. So it's fairly easy to compute alpha. Most of the computation goes in computing the eigenspectrum. We have some ablation studies as to how many samples you need to compute this eigenspectrum. The larger your representation space, the longer it takes. That's the short answer. So if you have, I don't know, 10,000 dimensional representation space, it'll take much longer. But for our case, it was 2048 dimensional for most cases. So it's fairly straightforward. I guess this is a follow-up to the question. You mentioned no labels are needed. Yes, there no label. Alpha does not require any labels. Effectively, what you're doing is you are passing the images, collecting the representations. You don't really care about what the labels are, and are looking at the cross covariance matrix. So you don't really need any labels. And maybe this was the question that for CFAR10 and STL10, these are all computed without any label information. The discussion is there a relation between alpha and matrix rank? Yes, absolutely. There is a strong alpha basically is anti-correlated to the rank or the effective rank of the matrix. So there is another metric out there which is very similar, tracks the same quantity effectively in slightly different formulations. It's called rank me. You can also alpha rank me are kind of equivalent measures of the same thing. They're both different ways of measuring the information content. You mentioned no labels are needed. What can the evaluation with STL10 and MIT67 without using the labels tell us? Oh, I see. Okay, so perhaps the question is more about this plot. So if you're not okay, so if you don't have the accuracy like values here, so it's just the x-axis, you can use the heuristic basically that if it's close to 1, it's a good enough good enough network, or it's a good enough representation space. So when I say proposal to filter out the models, if your alpha is like far away from 1 on either side, you can get rid of those representations. They're not going to help you as much. So anything that is close to 1, I think in general, you can use a heuristic of like 0.9 to 1.1 or something, but I should say it depends on the architecture. For instance, here for the transformer, it's like 0.8 to 1. which is kind of the Goldilocks zone. So it depends a bit on the architecture, which is why I think for self-supervised learning, when you have the same architecture, you can compare. It's a more apples to apples comparison. If you're comparing different models with different architectures, it can get tricky, and you need to keep that in mind, that there is more at play here that the architecture is doing, and you need to, because basically architecture provides an implicit bias over which features are easier to learn, and which features are not. So now what you're comparing is two different representation spaces that could be learning different features. So you need to focus a bit more on what is being learned, and not just stay at, like, how is that how are the features represented in the high dimensional space. So, but yeah, short answer to your question is, you can use this as a heuristic for alpha, especially, that if it's close to 1, you can use that as a good enough representation space. Right, and just to kind of, because I think this came up, we recently released uh, a library for evaluating these representation quality metrics. This is the QR code and the GitHub link. This is the logo that we have. It's called Reprix. If you want to evaluate alpha, rank me, there's another metric called LIDAR. Use this. You can use this library. Let us know how how things go. Um, we have some tutorial notebooks on how you can use this, and like a short snippet of code that you can kind of copy paste in your own repository, and get these metrics either while you're training or post training. And again, yeah, we are generally curious, because we would like to know how these metrics are useful in different domains. I think somebody asked about multimodal, like clip, lava training, but I'd also be curious in, like, how does it work for medical images? Because we've been working mostly natural images or natural language domain, but I'm curious to know how it looks in multimodal or medical images domains. Right, that's pretty much the end of my first part of the talk. I don't know, maybe Pulkit, I'll let you take a call on this, that how long do we want to go? Because I can quickly mention the second bit, which is more about the learning dynamics.
Yeah, you can continue as you had
All
planned.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. Then I guess a couple of leading questions after we got to the end of this part of the journey. And again, like, feel free to ask any questions. I can go back. So this is all, like, now we are into the domain of, like, whatever you see here is extra. So uh, I think a burning question that we had was, like, how does alpha evolve during learning? Because right now what we've been looking at is, let's pre-train our SSL networks for 100 epochs, 200 epochs. And at the end of that training, how does the alpha look like? One of the questions we had is, how does it evolve during learning? And this is, again, very preliminary evidence of how it looks like over learning. So if you look at it, alpha starts from a very high dimensional, low dimensional representation. So alpha is very high. As you keep training your self-supervised learning networks, it kind of goes low and converges around 1. And this is for a good hyperparameter setting. For hyperparameter settings, hyperparameter configurations that are not good, you will not see this thing come down. In fact, you will see it, like, I don't know, converge to something much higher, which is what we would say at the end as, like, a bad network. So that's something we've been looking more into that. And what does this mean to understand what representations are encoded? Because, as I've been saying repeatedly, that alpha tells us how the representations are constructed or distributed in this space. We don't really have a grasp of what these different axes are. If you're thinking in terms of eigenvalues and eigenvectors, we are looking only at the eigenvalue distribution. We are ignoring the eigenvectors. So in some sense, we wanted to get a bit more grasp of what are these eigenvectors. I'm going to skip that plot for now. So the other thing I did mention is looking at alpha in large language models. So this is a large language model suite called Pythia, where they release checkpoints at intermediate stages of their pre-training. This is what downstream task accuracy looks like for the different colors indicate different size of the model. And this is how alpha looks like. So again, very typical of your self-supervised learning training till like some stage, and then there is a decrease in the rank after, or the representations start to become low dimensional after. So there is much more going on in models trained using cross entropy, using an autoregressive kind of loss function. And we've been working more on trying to disentangle that, understand that. But I just wanted to give you guys a sneak peek to motivate that these metrics are not just specifically for convolutional neural networks or ResNets. These can also be used for transformer architectures, either trained on autoregressive loss functions or some sort of multimodal versions as well. So these functions are these metrics are more generic to different stimulus domains. But to kind of try and get an understanding of what representations are learned, we looked at a bit more into the dynamics of self-supervised learning. And this was a paper that was published at this recent NeurIPS, so NeurIPS 2024. Now, I've been talking to you about Barlow twins. There's some updates in terms of Big Craig and all of these loss functions that are slightly different. But in the Barlow twins paper, they talk about that you need a large projected dimensionality. In general, SSL, you need large amounts of unlabeled samples. And it's long pre-training protocols with like different, it feels a bit like the dark arts in order to get good performance on some ImageNet or CPAR10 in order to match supervised learning performance. So in some sense, you have to throw a boatload of data at your network. And that's kind of how you get these good representations. There is also a recent paper from Meta that talks about if you scale your data for training self-supervised learning networks, you can match these performances of like CLIP and multimodal sort of training. I do see a question here, did you evaluate Dino V2? We in our paper did not, but the following papers like RankMe and LIDAR did evaluate on Dino V2. They do compare with alpha. So again, they're all looking at the same metric in different forms. So yes, you can evaluate on Dino V2 and all of these like Dino, JEPA, everything is fair game. You can evaluate alpha on all of those representations. So there are some follow-up papers. Again, if you look at the RepRics repository, we cite all of those papers. So that's kind of where you can see those results on more recent SSL methods. I have personally done on Dino V2 as well, but more on the Dino networks, or as well as the JEPA networks. This is a very interesting question. Which one are the most promising SSL methods? I think it depends on the domain and your data, to be honest. So something that we show in this specific work is that there is an equivalence between all possible SSL loss functions. So they're all kind of learning the same thing. And maybe I'll answer this question a bit later on, but short answer is like every SSL method has its own pros and cons. It depends on your specific domain and data set, which one you want to apply. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I have a related question to that.
Yeah, go for it.
You can answer later as well when you answer that question. So, you talked about what a good representation means and how to evaluate a good representation, but how to answer this question that given a downstream task, what would be a good self-supervised representation learning? What task to choose to do SSL?
Yes. Okay. So I think there's a two-part answer to that question. One is how do you design your SSL pipeline, given that you know something about the downstream task, and second is how do you choose the best model once you've designed the pipeline. So right now, what I've been talking about is more the second question, that once you have a pipeline, how do you choose the best model that comes out of that pipeline? To answer the first part of the question, let's put a pin on that question and come back to it in like 5 slides.
Okay.
I think there's a follow-up on like which are most promising SSL methods without using labels. So most SSL methods don't use labels. I think if anything, I would say SSL methods are not supposed to use labels. The multimodal ones are the ones where they kind of have some alignment between your image domain and the language domains, you can kind of talk about labels, but yeah, none of them use target task labels. Right. So okay. So to try and understand, I think there's a great the question raised by you, Volker, for instance. It's like, okay, now we know something about the downstream task. How can we design a good SSL pipeline? So to try and get to that question, let's take a step back and try to understand what is SSL, what are these SSL methods actually doing? And we use the augmentation graph perspective, where basically, let's say again, let's think about natural images. Let's say you have an image of a white dog, a black dog, white bird, black bird. What you do is you take different augmentations of each image, which can be characterized as, let's say, different points in this image space that are obtained from the same image. You have different point clouds. So for each image, you have a point cloud, which is like all potential points that can come from that image by taking different augmentations. And you can quantify a sense of how much is the overlap of these point clouds across two different images. The statistical notion of comparing the overlap is basically calling it a kernel. So you say that you can say that there is a similarity kernel between two images X and Z, which is basically what is the, probabilistically speaking, what is the overlap of X and Z that is basically obtained from the same base image. So X naught is a base image. So you can kind of talk about what is the overlap between, or what is the likelihood of overlap between two dots here, is what is the likelihood that it came from the same image. So if you think about it, a white patch can be obtained from both a white dog and a white bird. So if you look at two white patches, it's very likely that they were obtained from the same image, as opposed to a white patch and a black patch, because they're probably obtained from different images. And if you look at, again, two images of, I don't know, a nose and little eyes, you're probably like, they came from the same image potentially because they're of dogs. And again, imagine this is like color inversion and all of this. So they're likely that they both came from images of dogs. So this is a way of expressing the degree of overlap in some probabilistic sense. You can write the loss that we want to optimize as we want to learn features F of X and Z, such that the inner product of Fx and Fz is basically matching this similarity kernel. And that's our North Star. That's what we want to learn. You can define this operator called TM. Again, there's some associated math machinery here, which is basically what is the average feature and expected value of the feature when the expectation is taken across all the augmentations of X. So basically, let's say X naught is an augmentation of X. You take an expectation over all features on X naught. There's an abusive notation. Sorry about that, but just wanted to keep all of them as like X. That's the input that goes into these operators. So it's basically the mean of feature value over augmentations. We show in this paper that you can write this loss and as an equivalent form as this, which is you want to minimize the disparity between the feature of each augmentation, so or each dot in this point cloud, from the average feature. So in some sense, you kind of want the point clouds to collapse. That's the big takeaway. While also subjecting to this orthogonality constraint, which is that different features should encode different properties. There should not be like redundancies in the feature space. And if you look at it, this seems very similar to what the Barlow twins framework does. But this is kind of the general equation of any self-supervised learning pipeline. There's certain works as well as us, we show that it can be like other SSL methods, the loss functions can be reduced to this form using some implicit or explicit biases that are incorporated by architecture or design choices. And what we show that basically, if you optimize this loss, this actually yields the eigenfunctions of the similarity kernel, which is why these two things are identical or equivalent loss functions. Now we will be optimizing this loss using gradient descent in all cases. And gradient descent has two key factors over which it is possible that there is, sorry, the question is that is the subscript denote different images or different dimensions. So when you say, I guess the subscript is like Fi that you're talking about. So Fi is basically different dimensions. Here it's basically different dimensions of your feature space, which is why Fi Fj rho x is the space of all images. So when you take an inner product between Fi and Fj over all possible images, that should be delta ij, which is 1 when I equal to j, it's 0 otherwise. So here the subscript is different dimensions, not images. Right. So again, gradient descent has two key factors. One is over which eigenfunctions are easier to learn. So it depends on the initialization. So what is the initial alignment between the network features at initialization and the eigenfunctions of the similarity kernel? So there's a selection bias over which eigenfunctions are learned. And the second is the singular values corresponding to eigenfunctions. Those features are learned first. So again, pictorially, what it means, if you have low dimensional embeddings, imagine by embeddings here, these features, Fs that you can learn. Let's say your purple and yellow are the eigenfunctions of your similarity kernel, the purple being the leading eigenvector, so a larger singular value corresponding to that eigenfunction. And this is your initial like feature that is defined at initialization of your neural network. When you start training using gradient descent, instead of turning to this, it will turn to the larger singular value eigenfunction. So that's the first result. If you have a high dimensional embedding, so the same case, but you have two different features, so initialized to be aligned like this and this will still turn to purple, this will turn to yellow, but at different rates. So this will turn much more slowly, which is the primacy bias. So you will end up learning the dominant eigenfunctions first, the less dominant eigenfunctions later on. And you can kind of like look at it pictorially that if you have a strong orthogonalization case where you want these two eigenfunctions to be orthogonal as possible, you will end up learning, sorry, before I go into this plot, so this is basically your original data space, so the augmentation cloud, you can, the augmentation graph or the point clouds. Different points indicate the point clouds obtained from different images or objects. You can think of this space, again, you can kind of see it, that there are two dominant eigenfunctions. One is the x-axis, one is the y-axis. The x-axis has a larger singular value associated because there's more spread. Y-axis has less. And this is where we are looking at the network output, the singular values that are learned by the network, and this is the alignment. But effectively, again, main takeaways, if you just look at this plot and try to see which features are learned, you see that the first thing that it learns is the x-axis. And if you keep, and if you keep running it for more time, then it starts to learn the y-axis. So the dominant direction is learned very early on, and you keep training it, it learns the less dominant axis. For weak orthogonalization case, the dominant axis is learned first, all good. But if you don't orthogonalize it strongly, the other feature also starts to get aligned with the dominant axis. Both of them learn singular values that are aligned with the same eigenvector. So you never really learn the other eigenfunction in the data space. So that is something that happens in a weak orthogonalization case. Great. Why does that matter for us? Is if you're training Barlow twins network or some Vic-Reg network, some variance and normalize orthogonalization constraint, what you have is you have that hyperparameter basically that tells you how much redundancy do you want across the features. In that, instead of having a weak orthogonalization, you should have a stronger orthogonalization because that means you're more efficiently utilizing the embedding space that you have. And on the other hand, you can use a weaker orthogonalization if you have a large embedding space because you have enough features to align to the different eigenfunctions. Right, this is just a recap. So basically, you want to use higher values of beta instead of increasing the embedding dimensionality. And this is what we show as basically here is the baseline or the fixed beta. So if you have a fixed orthogonalization constraint, as you increase the projected dimensionality, your test accuracy increases, which is the fundamental result from the Barlow twins paper or the Vic-Reg paper. But if you change the beta, so if you have higher beta for lower projected dimensionality, you can actually match performance. And this is again on CFAR 10, STL10, ImageNet 100. In all of these cases, you can kind of match the performance of an 8,192 dimensional embedding space projectors I think a 256 dimensional projector, which is a huge, like 100x reduction in the number of parameters in your projector. So that's a huge savings in your compute. The second recommendation is, if you remember, this is just a fancy way of writing our original loss function using the features, the feature mapping and the projector mapping. So this is just like take an input, like this is the jth augmentation of the ith image, xi. You pass them through f, pass them through theta, you have your tm operator. Empirically, when we want to optimize this, we will replace this with an estimate of the with an empirical estimate of the mean instead of taking all possible augmentations. And if you use multiple augmentations, this estimate is better, so you get better signal from the loss function. So for each input sample, you use more augmentations and you get more bang for your buck. And once again, we show that if you improve the optimization, if you improve the loss function signal, you can actually get better convergence early on in training, as well as better performance after some fixed budget training. So once again, the gray line here is two augmentations. The gray and the blue lines are two augmentations. The gray is the baseline network that, let's say, the Barlow twins or the Vic-Craig paper ran, and the red is basically four augmentations. Obviously, increasing the number of augmentations comes at a higher compute budget. So what we also wanted to do is match the compute budget here. So if we run more augmentations, but less number of unique samples, you still get better convergence, better performance. So here what we're doing is we are using multiple patch from or multiple augmentations from each images, but using less number of unique samples. So in some way, you can learn more from less amount of data. I mean, obviously, at some point it takes a hit, especially in ImageNet 100. You see like 8 augmentations, but only 25% of the pre-training samples you're not learning as well. But 4 augmentations, half of the pre-training samples you still learn as well as you would do for the entire training data. So in some sense, you're improving the data efficiency or sample efficiency of SSL pipelines, which I think again is something that we need, especially when we are looking at training large models for that long. We probably want to get as much as we can from each data point, especially in a data scarce regime. So in some sense, you can, again, if you are more familiar with that, or if you like to think in those terms, you can think of each augmentation being a synthetic sample, synthetic data. So you're generating more synthetic samples to augment your actual data set of the real samples. Right. I think this is a good point to stop. The key takeaways are basically, again, it allows you to do more compute and sample efficient SSL. I do feel I zipped through this part a bit more than I would have liked. So feel free to ask any questions at this point. But this is pretty much the last slide that I would have for the talk.
Not sure if you answered the
Yeah.
last question, which is still in the Q&A. I think you did. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think I did. So I think that's
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah, while people are, I don't know, typing up their questions, I'll just go to my acknowledgement slide, which is entire lab from our entire lab at Mila, Blake's group. It's been a fun ride with the PhD. It's been an absolute, um, it's been an amazing experience doing a PhD with Blake. I think I've been fortunate to work in a lab that is, this is nice people, amazing people, very smart people, and in the space where I think that it's a budding field, and there's a lot to be done here, and there's a lot of expertise from each of the domains in terms of like neuroscience and AI. I think the neuro AI domain is one where that expertise can be leveraged to kind of harness new directions, new research as well as engineering directions. So both open questions as well as optimization or optimizing the existing directions. All right, I never really answered the question which SSL method to use. I just remembered by looking at the start of the question that there are many SSL methods. So to answer your question, Pulkit, and I think some of the associated questions that were there, like I said, there are two parts of the question. One is if you know your downstream task, or what downstream task you want, there are two things. One is how do you design the SSL pipeline? The second is how do you choose the best model that comes out of the pipeline? So to choose the best model, you basically use AlphaRec or RankMe or your favorite metric. They're all equivalent. To design your pipeline, I think, like I said, this is where the entire design thing comes in, where uh, you basically have some sort of control over what eigenfunctions are learned when you design the type of augmentations you use. So if you have some sense of what is the downstream task and what are the invariance properties you would require in that downstream task, you bake that in your augmentation, like how you derive different images from, or different augmentations or different versions of each image. So I don't know, for instance, if in this particular data set with 4 images, you wanted to, you know that your downstream task is to determine the color of the fur or feather, you would actually design augmentations that are more invariant to the actual object. So you preserve color but take different crops of the at different resolutions. But if you want to care both about the color and the object category, you would you would probably, or you would want to care more about the object category, you would want to have more color augmentations that don't really preserve the information about the color of the fur or the feather, but they capture more the structure of the object or the background that is preserved. So that's kind of getting into, because once you do that, you have a sense of uh, how these eigenfunctions would look like in some high dimensional space, because those are the eigenfunctions that correspond to how the crops are how the augmentation space is distributed. And that's what your neural network will learn once you start to do some self-supervised learning. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's great. I think you have
Okay.
more questions now.
Yes, yes. So now going on to the question. So there are many SSL methods. Which SSL methods are most effective for image classification according to your evaluation? So I think I should say that most of the methods that we have been using here are are trained on ResNets. For ResNets, I think the Barlow twins, BigReg work pretty well. SimClear works pretty well as well. The problem with SimClear is it's a contrastive learning algorithm. So you need to have a sense of what is positive as well as what is negative. So in some sense, what I was talking about here is the augmentations are only talking about what is a positive sample. So all points of the same color are positive samples of each other. Negative samples would be basically different images coming from different patches coming from different images, but you need to keep an eye out for negative samples. And in fact, if you're doing some sort of complicated uh, image or complicated domain, you need to have a curriculum of how you show the negative samples. So there is a lot of work on learning good representations of videos that tries to do a curriculum of the negative samples. But for non-contrastive self-supervised learning methods like Barlow twins or VCREG, you can just stay with positive examples. So for image classification, I would say, especially if you're using a residual network, I think I think Barlow twins or VCREG are pretty good. Even BYOL is pretty good. So non-contrastive, you're good. For contrastive, again, you need to keep an eye out for negative samples, but they're pretty good as well. Again, at the end of the day, they're kind of equivalent because they're all trying to optimize this sort of a loss function. For when you're using transformers, I think what works best is the JEPA style of models. There's also masked image modeling. I I don't I don't know what the verdict is on which scales better with more data. Uh, right now, from what I remember, JEPA does scale, so Dino or JEPA does scale much better with data than masked image modeling. And there's also a paper on basically when we talk about like the rate of learning of the different eigenfunctions. It turns out JEPA, Dino, all these momentum encoder-based models learn a different learn different eigenfunctions early on as compared to masked image modeling. So if you have the budget to train till infinity, both those methods learn the same same features, but the rate or the order in which the eigenfunctions are learned are slightly different for masked image modeling, autoregressive style training, and the JEPA methods. So if you're looking at transformer, I would say go with JEPA, Dino stuff, more SSL methods. To make SSL methods general. Oh, I guess that was the same question. Okay.
Sorry, I
No. That's all
didn't
good.
get the question.
I can go
But I
back.
think it's here. It should be in the unset tab.
Yeah. I'm gonna read that out. To make SSL methods general, let's assume that we have little knowledge about all possible target tasks. Exactly. That's kind of the idea behind using alpha. That because if we don't know much about the target tasks that we're going to face in the future, I think you can kind of have some very prior, like very, low level priors. For instance, when you're defining your augmentations, you want to say that I want to keep as many features as I want, as many attributes, preserve as many attributes as I can, which is why people use crops, rotations, translations for natural images. I don't think those transformations necessarily work for medical images because but you need to think about certain augmentations, certain image transformations that can generate these synthetic samples without destroying or without losing the attributes. Once you have that, I think what you're asking the network to learn is a general feature space that is good for a lot of different downstream tasks. And in that case, then you can use your alpha to evaluate how good the representation space is, or like look at some eigenfunctions or eigenvectors that you've learned in the representation space to try and understand what are the attributes that are being picked out by your network.
Uh, that's great. I think it's about time. It's one.
Yeah.
It's. I have one last question.
Yeah, go for it.
Open-ended. I've always been curious,
Mhm.
and I don't know much about this field, but it's been a fascinating talk, and I'm sure
Thank you.
everyone learned a lot about how to apply, especially to medical domain. And the slides were great. I'm sure you had a great PhD defense.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to ask, like, so I've seen a lot of work where people have used, as you like, they have spent a lot of time thinking about eigenvalues and eigenvectors because that's the most natural thing to see. What are your thoughts on like what are future directions looking beyond just the eigenspectrum? What other methods do people explore, and what are your thoughts on that?
So I think, okay, there's two flavor of questions that I generally receive, especially when presenting the alpha rec stuff, which is kind of going into the eigenspectrum SVT domain. One is, why are we looking at just the eigenvectors, eigenvalues? Because they're good for linear regression. There exist nonlinear dimensionality reduction or intrinsic dimensionality estimation techniques? Why aren't we using that? And basically that all comes under the field of like manifold geometry and topology and topological deep learning and stuff like that. Uh, I think nonlinear manifold or nonlinear dimensionality estimation or reduction techniques are great if you want to get a hold of what is the intrinsic dimensionality of your actual representations or data and gain some intuitions into, let's say, the dynamics or how do the representation space looks like. The only problem is I'm not sure if gradient descent looks at that stuff. The difference is, there's a bit of a profound difference here. One is like we have our own language to describe representations or computations. Gradient descent and neural networks have their own language. So there is certain priors that gradient descent imposes on your on what you learn, which is why I think using some sort of eigenvectors and eigenvalues is a good characterization because that's closer to the language that, let's say, neural networks and gradient descent use among themselves to talk about computations. I do, like, what do we want going beyond eigenvectors, eigenvalues? I think a better hold of the role of nonlinearities in how those representations are shaped when it goes across like different layers. Because so more recent work has, I think there is some work on like rich learning versus lazy learning, where in lazy learning you're learning features, you're not learning features, necessarily tuned to the downstream loss. So your features are more or less, static, and you're just learning the readout weights to get the best of your loss. Rich learning is where you're shaping your features best to get to the loss. And I think in those cases, the initialization, the scale of the initialization, or in some sense, like the relative scale of initialization matters a lot. But that also goes into linearized regimes of neural networks and so on. I think what we need to get a better hold of, and maybe it's the proposal that I'm making is really an intractable math problem, but we only find out once we investigate more into it, is what is the role of nonlinearities? Like I think piecewise nonlinearity is very commonly used, but also like these LU and GLU nonlinearities. How do they affect the representation space when it goes through different layers of computations? I think that is something that how does that represent or change or fold the space and affect the eigenspectrum is something that we have not gotten a very good hold of. I think most people operate in a linearized regime.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very too many things to think about.
Yeah, a lot of things to think about. I mean, I think, yeah, that's why I said like there's a lot of directions that you can go into. And I mean, we also have some study with kind of going back to the brain. So evaluating these metrics on, let's say, functional fMRI responses in the brain. And what we find is early on in the visual areas, at least, the rank doesn't change or the alpha doesn't change much. But if you go to like higher order areas where it's more like functionally specialized for certain tasks, you no longer have a power law representation. So again, there's something to think about in terms of like power law is only good if you want to learn generic task invariant representations. If you have one particular downstream task, power laws are not the best thing to do, because power laws are kind of are a result of like some maximum entropy problem that you're optimizing in some very generic way of speaking. If you know what specific task you have in mind, you probably don't need power law. You probably just need those features represented very well. That is the task relevant features. So there is also a distinction there, which is again that's something that has to be studied more, especially when you want to put models that actually work in real life, problems, because in the real life, you don't want a model for CT scan to be working as well for, I don't know, an MRI. It's the different models, the different applications, different domains. So in some sense, you don't want an LLM that is good for CT scans. You probably want a model that is specialized for each domain. Sure, you can have a generic model that feeds representations, but that can have a power law. But models that are very specific to tasks, you may not require that sort of a representation. So that's another thing to think about. And how do we optimize in those spaces is another open question in some sense. Because if you know there are certain power laws or certain slopes that are optimal, let's just optimize for that. I mean, why are we doing all of these shenanigans and asking gradient descent to get to that? Let's just directly optimize that.
Sounds great. Well, I think it's about time. So the
But
recording will be available on YouTube soon. And let's thank our speaker a lot. And also thanks everyone for attending on a Saturday. It was a
yeah,
great.
thank you so much for organizing. It was I had a lot of fun answering all the questions and the discussions. Thank you.
I must say this is one of the sessions where we have received the most number of questions so far.
I'm glad. I'm glad that's the case. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right. Have a good one. Bye bye.